6 months after installing a tangled line of iron pipes and 2 heavy brass valves along the rocky creek bed, Jacob Yoder stood at the highest crest of his ridge in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He watched clean, ice-cold water gush effortlessly out of a 1-inch line into a 2,000-gallon holding tank. The water was climbing 130 feet straight up the steep hillside, defying gravity, without a single electrical wire, without the roar of a diesel motor, and without costing a single nickel in fuel. Just 200 yards across the fence line, on the neighboring commercial farm, the only sound was the heavy, suffocating silence of panic. The neighbor's high-capacity electric pumps had been dead for 4 days straight, following a major regional grid blackout. And his backup diesel generators, which devoured gallons of expensive fuel by the hour, had finally run dry because local fuel prices had spiked so high that running them meant filing for bankruptcy before harvest season even arrived. The very same industrial farmers who 6 months earlier had rumbled past in their massive air-conditioned tractors, pointing and laughing at Jacob in his straw hat and leather suspenders, were now standing by the fence line. They stood with their arms crossed and their heads hanging low, staring in disbelief at Jacob's fields, the only vibrant, lush green patch of crops remaining in the entire scorched valley. Those neighboring farms were spending over $3,000 a month just to pay for electricity and diesel fuel to run their irrigation rigs. Jacob hadn't spent a single penny. He used nothing more than the natural weight of falling water and the ancient mechanical wisdom of people who know that nature works for free if you know how to ask politely. If you've ever been judged for choosing the simpler path, if you've ever been told by someone that your methods were outdated, or that you were falling behind just because you refused to join the rat race of spending money you don't have to buy gear you don't need, this story is for you. It's about a man who proved that true progress isn't about buying the most expensive machine. It's about having the quiet intelligence to accomplish massive results using almost nothing at all. To understand how a bent iron pipe and 2 simple valves managed to push thousands of gallons of water up a steep hill with 0 horsepower, you have to go back to the day the summer heatwave first hit Pennsylvania and fuel bills started crushing local family farms. Jacob Yoder was 52 years old. He was an Old Order Amish farmer living in a quiet settlement nestled in the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania. His community lived by traditional principles: no grid electricity, no automobiles, no smartphones, and no gas-powered engines in their crop fields. He wore simple denim trousers held up by leather suspenders, a plain blue cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed straw hat that shaded a sun-weathered face. Jacob's farm sat on fertile soil, but it was challenging land. His farmhouse, barn, and vegetable fields, where he grew heirloom tomatoes, cabbages, sweet corn, and pole beans, were situated high up on a hilltop plateau. The creek, however, flowed at the very bottom of the property, down in a steep ravine 130 feet below the fields. For a modern commercial farmer, solving this problem was straightforward and fast. Drive to the equipment dealership in town, buy a 10-horsepower gas or diesel centrifugal pump, run 1,000 feet of heavy hose, crank the ignition, and blast the water up the ridge. Jacob's neighbor, a commercial grower named Mark Henderson, who owned a 300-acre operation and loved showing off new machinery, had done just that. Mark spent nearly $40,000 installing a state-of-the-art automated pivot irrigation system. He bought a massive yellow diesel generator the size of a pickup truck and high-pressure electric pumps. Every single morning at 5 a.m., the entire valley echoed with the deafening roar of Mark's diesel engine. Rumble, rumble, rumble. Black exhaust billowed into the morning sky, and water blasted out of aluminum sprinklers on the hill. Mark bragged about it at the local diner. He told anyone listening that any farmer who didn't use horsepower was wasting their time and living in the dark ages. Jacob, meanwhile, spent his mornings hauling heavy wooden pails of water up the steep ravine path on his shoulders, just to keep his young seedlings alive. It was brutal, back-breaking labor from dawn until dusk. One evening at the dinner table, watching Jacob rub his sore shoulders and swollen hands, his wife Sarah spoke softly. "Jacob, the Lord gave us strength in our arms, but he also gave us understanding in our minds. We do not use engines, but that creek down in the hollow runs with great power every day. Is there not a wiser way to let the water carry its own weight up the hill so you do not break your back?" Jacob looked down at his calloused hands, took a sip of hot peppermint tea, and nodded. "You speak truth, Sarah. The creek has energy placed into it by creation. I only need to find the right way to ask that energy to do the lifting for us." The next morning, Jacob walked over to the community's shared blacksmith shop and storage barn. He began digging through wooden crates of antique iron fittings, scrap steel pipes, and brass hardware that had been sitting undisturbed since his grandfather's time. He was searching for the components to build a very old, nearly forgotten device invented over 2 centuries ago, a device that modern industrial agriculture abandoned when cheap fossil fuels took over: the hydraulic ram pump. Late that afternoon, Mark Henderson pulled his heavy-duty Ford Dually pickup to a stop along the dirt road, separating their properties. He looked down into the ravine and saw Jacob standing knee-deep in the Cold Creek water, digging a shallow stone channel and fitting a heavy 3-inch iron pipe into a small timber dam. Mark rolled down his window, leaned out, and yelled down with a grin, "Hey, Jacob! What are you doing down in the mud there, buddy? Building a beaver dam?" Jacob looked up, wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, and replied calmly, "I am setting up a ram pump, neighbor, to carry water up to the garden on the ridge." Mark let out a loud laugh. "A ram pump? You mean those old iron clunkers from the 1800s? Jacob, come on. You can't push water 130 feet up a vertical ridge with a scrap iron toy. You need real horsepower. You need 60 pounds of head pressure. Come look at my new diesel rig. It fills a 5,000-gallon tank in 20 minutes flat." Jacob kept tightening a heavy brass valve flange with a pipe wrench and answered quietly, "Your diesel pump needs oil every day, Mark, and oil costs money from the bank. The creek asks for no payment. If I set the pipe true, the creek will lift its own water." Mark just shook his head, stepped on the gas, and drove off, chuckling to himself about how stubborn the Amish were for refusing to join the modern world. So how exactly does this simple iron device manage to push thousands of gallons of water up a steep hill without an engine, electricity, or solar panels? The mechanics behind it are so elegantly simple that it feels like magic, but it's pure natural physics, the kind of practical science every homesteading farmer understands once they pay attention to how nature behaves. Imagine you are running at full speed down a hallway, holding a heavy bucket of water, and suddenly you slam a door shut right in front of your face. What happens to the water in the bucket? It doesn't just stop instantly. Its momentum surges forward, slamming against the door and splashing violently upward over the rim. That exact phenomenon is what powers a hydraulic ram pump. Engineers call it water hammer, but on the farm, we just call it the water's punch. Jacob installed a thick, heavy iron pipe, called the drive pipe, leading from his small timber dam down to the pump body in the creek bed. As water enters this drive pipe upstream, gravity pulls it downward. As it flows downhill through the pipe, the water gains speed, weight, and tremendous kinetic momentum. At the end of this drive pipe, down in the creek bed, sits the pump assembly. Its primary component is an open brass valve called the waste valve, or the punch valve. At first, this valve hangs wide open due to a weighted spring. The water comes rushing down the iron pipe and starts spilling out through this open valve into the creek. But as the water accelerates, it reaches a speed where its sheer force grabs the valve gate and slams it shut with a loud, sudden metallic thud. Clack! When that valve slams shut in a fraction of a millisecond, thousands of pounds of moving water inside the iron pipe are forced to come to a dead stop. But all that kinetic energy has to go somewhere. The water cannot bounce backward because more water is rushing down behind it from the creek dam. So that sudden stoppage creates a massive shockwave of pressure inside the pump body, a violent hydraulic punch. Directly inside the pump, right next to the closed valve, sits a second valve, a one-way check valve leading into a sealed steel air chamber. When the water punch hits, it blasts open this second valve and forces a surge of high-pressure water up into the air chamber. Inside that chamber, trapped air gets squeezed down like a compressed steel spring. A split second later, as the shockwave subsides, that compressed air expands violently backward, snapping the check valve shut and shoving that trapped water up into a narrow delivery pipe heading straight up the hill. Then the cycle resets instantly. The main waste valve drops open again, water rushes down the pipe, gains momentum, and clack! Another punch, another surge of water pushed up the hill. Clack, clack, clack! 40, 50, 60 times every single minute. Every time the pump slams shut, it only pushes a small cup of water up the hill. A single cup doesn't sound like much, does it? But a cup of water every 2 seconds adds up to 30 cups a minute. That's nearly 2 gallons a minute. That's over 2,500 gallons of crystal clear water delivered to the hilltop holding tank every single day. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Never stopping, never overheating, never needing an oil change, never blowing a spark plug, and never generating a single bill. On the afternoon Jacob finished calibrating the tension spring on the waste valve, a steady rhythmic sound began echoing through the quiet hollow. Clack, clack, clack. Jacob walked up the steep ravine path, following the thin 1-inch polyethylene pipe he had strung through the woods up to his hilltop storage tank. Sarah was standing up on the wooden platform by the barn, holding an empty bucket. For the first 10 minutes, nothing came out of the pipe except a steady hiss of escaping air. Then suddenly the air cleared, and a thick, continuous, icy cold stream of fresh creek water blasted out of the pipe, filling the holding tank with a satisfying splash. The water was climbing 130 feet of vertical elevation with so much pressure that it looked like a commercial 5-horsepower pump was running down in the woods. Sarah held her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with joy. "Jacob, it works! The water is climbing!" Jacob took off his straw hat, bowed his head for a brief moment of quiet gratitude, and put his hat back on. The pump was running, and it wasn't going to stop. For the next 3 weeks, life in the valley seemed normal to anyone passing by. Mark Henderson continued firing up his massive diesel generator every morning, filling the valley with dark exhaust and engine noise, burning through $100 worth of fuel a day to keep his commercial tomato and melon fields hydrated. Every time Mark drove past Jacob's farm, he looked over at the ridge, convinced that Jacob's low-tech iron pipe would clog or lose pressure within a week. Then came the first week of July, and with July came the worst weather disaster Lancaster County had seen in 25 years. A record-breaking heat wave settled over the northeast, sending temperatures soaring past 105 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 straight days. The regional electrical grid, overloaded by millions of air conditioners running full blast in the cities, suffered a catastrophic transformer explosion at a main substation. The entire county went dark. Every electric irrigation pump in the valley died instantly. Commercial farmers rushed to their barns to fire up their backup gas and diesel generators. But luck was not on their side. A national transport strike combined with a sudden refinery outage caused fuel supplies across the state to dry up overnight. Local gas stations put up "out of diesel" signs. At the few pumps that had fuel left, prices skyrocketed to over $7 a gallon, and stations limited sales to 5 gallons per customer. 5 gallons of diesel didn't even give Mark Henderson 2 hours of runtime on his 50-horsepower pump. By day 5 of the blackout and fuel shortage, the summer sun scorched the valley without mercy. Mark's commercial crop fields began to turn brown. His high-yield tomato plants, which required consistent moisture to prevent blossom-end rot, wilted and collapsed. Tens of thousands of dollars in commercial produce were baking into dry dust right before his eyes. Mark sat on the bumper of his truck, his head in his hands, staring at his dying fields in sheer despair. And that's when, through the hot, still summer air, he heard a sound coming from across the fence, a steady, rhythmic, peaceful, metallic beat echoing up from the wooded ravine. Clack, clack, clack. Mark raised his head. He walked slowly over to the fence line and looked up at Jacob's ridge. Jacob's farm looked like a green oasis in the middle of a desert. His cabbage heads were tight and crisp. His tomato vines were heavy with ripening fruit. And up on the highest hill, water was overflowing from Jacob's storage tank, trickling down through gravity-fed drip lines directly into the vegetable beds. Jacob's hydraulic ram pump didn't care about the power grid. It didn't care about gas station lines. It didn't care about international oil prices. It only cared that water was flowing downhill in the creek. And as long as gravity existed, the creek kept flowing. Mark stood at the fence for nearly 20 minutes, watching that water gush without an engine, without noise, without pollution, and without costing a dime. All of Mark's pride evaporated right there on the dusty lane. He unlatched the wire gate, stepped onto Jacob's land, and walked up toward the barn. Jacob was kneeling in a row of sweet corn, pulling a few weeds by hand. "Jacob!" Mark called out, his voice hoarse and strained. Jacob stood up, dusted the rich, dark soil from his hands, and greeted his neighbor with a calm smile. "Good afternoon, Mark. What can I do for you on this warm day?" Mark looked down at his boots, then looked over at the water overflowing from Jacob's holding tank. "Jacob, my crops are dying over there. The power grid is down, the gas stations are empty, and I can't run my irrigation rig. If I don't get water on those fields by tonight, I'm going to lose the entire season. I'm going to lose my farm." Jacob looked at Mark's stressed face. There was no smugness in the Amish farmer's eyes. There was no, "I told you so." There was only the quiet, neighborly compassion of a man who sees someone in need. "We have more than enough water in the upper tank, Mark," Jacob said softly. "We can run a 2-inch gravity hose from my tank across the fence to your main header line. It will give you enough pressure to save your tomato rows today." Mark's eyes widened. You'd do that for me? After I made fun of your setup?" Jacob smiled gently beneath his straw hat. "The water does not belong to me, Mark. It is a gift from above. The creek is only lending us its strength. Go fetch your long hose." That evening, the two neighbors worked side by side until sunset, running a temporary line across the property boundary to soak Mark's dying crops. As the cool water spread through the dry dirt rows, Mark sat down on a wooden crate next to Jacob and looked down toward the ravine where the steady thud of the ram pump continued to echo. "Jacob," Mark asked quietly, "how does that thing really work down there? Why doesn't it ever break down?" Jacob picked up a small twig and began drawing a diagram in the soft dirt at their feet, explaining the simple physics of the water's punch. "You see, Mark," Jacob explained in his even, measured voice, "most people think that to get great power you must create a new force from scratch, like burning gasoline in a cylinder. But nature's wisdom isn't about creating new force. It's about channeling the force that is already moving." He pointed to the lines in the dirt. "Water coming down a pipe carries immense weight. When you close the door on it suddenly, all that weight turns into a hammer. The pump consumes no energy because it uses 90% of the water's falling weight just to push the remaining 10% high up into the air. The fall itself creates the lift. And it never wears out? It has only two moving parts, Mark. Two brass valves with simple rubber gaskets. If a gasket wears down 2 years from now, I unbolt two nuts, cut a new ring out of an old leather boot or rubber inner tube, and it runs for another 2 years. There are no spark plugs to foul, no carburetors to clog, no oil to change, and no circuit boards to fry in a lightning storm. Mark looked out over his fields and sighed. I spent $40,000 on a machine that left me helpless when I needed it most. And you built a system out of scrap iron that never stops working. The danger of expensive machinery, Jacob concluded thoughtfully, isn't just the price tag in the store. It is the dependency it creates in your life. When you depend on something you cannot repair yourself, and that requires outside fuel just to survive, you do not truly own your farm. You are just renting it from the fuel company. 10 days later, the electrical grid was finally restored across Pennsylvania, and diesel shipments resumed. But the mindset of the farmers in that valley changed forever. Mark Henderson didn't throw away his commercial equipment, but by the following spring, he had cleared out a section of his creek bed, bought heavy iron pipe, and installed a twin commercial ram pump system of his own. Within 2 years, nearly a dozen homesteaders and family farms throughout Lancaster County had installed hydraulic ram pumps along their streams. Today, if you drive through the rolling green hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, or through any rural valley across America where practical self-reliance is valued, you might just hear that familiar rhythmic metallic beat echoing from the trees along the creek. Clack, clack, clack. It is the sound of gravity working for free. The sound of true energy independence. A quiet reminder to every grower and homesteader that real innovation isn't about inventing the most complicated machine. It's about learning to work with the natural laws of creation so that when the rest of the world grinds to a halt, your farm keeps flowing. If this story brought value to your day, if you learned something new about off-grid water systems, or if you know a friend or fellow gardener who needs a reminder about the power of simple living, share this video with them. Subscribe to The Rural Porch. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our weekly stories. And leave a comment below telling us your thoughts on Amish mechanical wisdom. And remember, on the farm, the strongest tool isn't the one that makes the most noise. It's the one that keeps working in silence long after all the others have stopped. God bless, and we'll see you on the next story.